Hasse Hassan Sorensen. Fake old. The art of reading history with the right grain of salt. Tiny boots. As you read about Emperor Caligula, your eyes widen, and you become increasingly impressed with the level of insanity and outrageous decadence. You will read about how he killed every advisor, shagged his sisters, adapted all the deity statues in Rome to reflect his own facial features, made a pontoon bridge across 5 kilometers of bay to make a point, and declared war on the sea. If you are a reasonably intelligent person with the ability of critical thinking, at one point you will think, bullshit. How could a person at this level of madness get so far, and even manage the world's greatest empire for so long? And you are presumably right.
The story is very likely utter bullshit.
Not even Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, or Robert Mugabe could get away with this level of insanity.
But there's a difference. The leaders of our time, even the most insane leaders, are documented in real time.
Whatever you might claim about them after their deaths, and no matter how far the rumors can spread on social media, it will relatively quickly be debunked. In the time of Caligula's successors, it was possible to destroy the limited number of contemporary documents, deface the statues, and rewrite history altogether. If he at one point said his horse could do a better job than the incompetent senators, in rewritten history it will be that he appointed his horse senator. Generally speaking, if your predecessor was your own family, as it is when you inherit the throne, you will generally portray them as more glorious than they originally were. You will put them on a pedestal, to shine some glory on your lineage. If you beat your predecessor in a revolution or election, you will degrade them. Disregard for human life, decadence, sexual misconduct, irrational decisions, and a narcissistic God complex are some of the traits you will often find in post-mortem historic descriptions of unpopular rulers. The perception of sexual misconduct changes from culture to culture and time to time, but in most cases sex with animals, sex with your children, or acknowledging a child with a slave woman is a safe bet. Decadence is a little harder, as a ruler is obligated to impress both the population and foreign dignitaries. We need to know you are successful. But again, depending on the culture and period, there's a line you shouldn't cross. In Caligula's case, it was perhaps the marble palace for his horse, and the horse food sprinkled with gold leaves, while the population was starving in the streets. Disregard for human lives might be hard to nail in the time of gladiator games and public executions, but the nobility was off limits, and Nero playing the harp while watching Rome burn to ashes, trapping countless innocent victims in the flames, would enrage most, I guess. And this, my dear reader, is probably the reason why you should discharge most of these descriptions as bullshit. Accurate scrutiny is difficult, as we most commonly don't have alternative sources, but rely on a single history writer. Simultaneously, common sense is hard to use as a guide, as common sense and the modern moral compass doesn't necessarily apply to a 2,000-year-old history. In Egypt, the royal family were supposed to be pure blood, meaning they had children with their siblings. Or at least pretended to. In Rome, incest was frowned upon, just as it is in modern Western cultures. So the Romans were disgusted by the disrespectful Emperor Julius Caesar shagging this inbred harlot Cleopatra.
But presumably not as outraged as people would be today.
Obviously, the incestuous habits of the Egyptian nobility wasn't breaking news, as everybody would have been aware of this phenomenon. So we can presumably tone it down a notch from outrage to dismay. Also take into account that Egypt wasn't an enemy. Egypt was actually a Roman-conquered autonomous region, and the primary supplier of grain and other food products. What I'm trying to say is this: it's not only the facts we must sort, but even the levels we must adjust. What will make you arrange large protest demonstrations today might have made people shrug 2,000 years ago, and vice versa. In some cases, you'll have to apply a completely different set of logic to understand what the hell people were thinking. In Viking Age Scandinavia, confessing to murder could get you acquitted if you had good reasons, or acted in self-defense. So you had to confess to the first person you met, after the murder. You were, however, allowed to pass 3 households before confessing. Initially, that makes no sense at all. But with the knowledge that settlements in the Viking Age were often laid out in such a way that the neighbors were very likely family members, it makes more sense.
Of course, you shouldn't confess to a murder to the next of kin.
Another Viking example: in pre-Christian Scandinavia, brave young men would prefer to spend the afterlife action-packed. But in order to get to the realm of the fallen warriors, you had to die brave. This could explain why some would actually prefer to be subject to a vicious torture execution, rather than being dragged to the merciful hangman's noose. So many parameters. As you read the historical accounts of all these insane rulers and people of the past, you must remember how the writers have praised or tarnished their legacy, to fit the contemporary narrative. Often they have been given nicknames to coin them, that wouldn't have been in everyday use in their lifetime. Caligula was nicknamed this way as a child, while he was dressed as a little soldier.
It translates to tiny boots.
There isn't a snowball's chance in hell he has been called this as an emperor. Or what about King Ethelred the Unready Jay? I believe this nickname would have insulted him profoundly. There are several examples in history of nicknames that have definitely not been commonly used in the royal court, or perhaps at all. Who's who now? Now we get to the good part, where it gets really messy: compound characters.
Or perhaps mistaken identities.
In the oral tradition, a tale was not praised for its accuracy or value as a testimony, but for its values in other ways. It had to be entertaining, it had to contain recognizable elements, it had to mirror the contemporary moral values, and sometimes it even had to fit into some rules for contemporary poetry. Several stories are recycling the same heroes and villains, and some of these characters would be loosely based on, or inspired by, actual historical people. Often, a number of actual historical people would in time blend into one. A brilliant but somewhat exhausted example is Ragnar Lothbrok, who was born in 5 different places, died in 3, and had to live for 500 years to achieve it all. There's little doubt that several people ended up in this pot, and the casserole has been spiced quite a lot, with elements from other stories and an abundance of imagination. Almost insignificant linguistic details can have altered important aspects of a story. What if Robin Hood was very skilled with a crossbow or a sling, but arrow rhymes with narrow? Then we will change our hero's gimmick. When translated, it might end up as a blowpipe, to rhyme in a new language, or be more relevant and recognizable. Reinterpretation is nothing new. On the contrary, when Sherlock Holmes suddenly lives in New York City, and is an alcoholic instead of a cocaine addict, there will be orthodox fans protesting loudly. In medieval storytelling, the audience would presumably have been more open to new interpretations, inconsistencies, and jamming surprises. Obviously, stories have to be updated to fit contemporary ethics. If you see a Disney movie these days, the screen is full of disclaimers about ethnic stereotypes, smoking, inappropriate language, etc. In 50 years, so much has changed. Now imagine how much more would have changed in 200 years, through a change of religion and regime. The most romantic gesture of bestowing your precious loved one with 40 obedient slaves simply has to be replaced by something else. Roses, perhaps. One century, committing suicide on your lover's grave is highly appreciated as a romantic gesture. The next century, it's a ticket to hell. In modern Californian cinema, when a man has been murdered, the right thing to do is find the killer and avenge the murder in cold blood, or bring him to justice. A few hundred years ago, that would be completely pointless. If you want to help, take the dead man's place behind the plow. So stories have been updated time and again, to fit the reality in which they were told. Reading about then now.
It's too easy making the mistake of reading history with modern specs. There's simply too many aspects to keep in mind when reading.
The language was different. The political situation, the gender roles, the borders, the climate, the cuisine, the ethics, the etiquette, the beliefs, the technology. One very common mistake made by the novel history reader is the borders. Haraldr Hårfagre created Norway as a unified nation in the year 872. Cool. But the Norway he unified is not the Norway we see today. It was a much smaller Norway, not including the northern part that was inhabited by a sparse population of Sami people. It wasn't the inland mountain range that had no value, and it wasn't the southernmost part that was a part of Denmark. You might think that Trondheim and Oslo are naturally connected in the same landscape, and should logically fit into one country divided from Denmark by the sea. This is where technology comes in. There were no highways or train tracks. Forests and mountains weren't connecting anything. On the contrary, the ocean was the highway of the time, and a much better connection. Opposite coasts would be a logical unity 1,000 years ago. Second example, how could Russia be inferior to Sweden in the 17th century? Russia is such a large empire.
Yes. Now it is. But Finland was a part of Sweden until the 18th century, and Russia didn't conquer Siberia until the 18th century.
Siberia is about 80% of present-day Russia. Most countries were not divided by exact maps, fences and border control, but by vast landscapes that were no man's land. Timber, meaning forests, wasn't a precious or rare commodity, and areas that were useless as farmland were of interest to nobody. A few people would live in these unclaimed areas, and adding them all up, many people weren't a part of any kingdom, and didn't have a nationality and a king. In fact, most people, inside and outside kingdoms, would identify with their village or settlement, the language they spoke, the religion they had, and perhaps some kind of ethnicity or tribal affiliation. You might be the subject of a king, but after a war somewhere else, you would be paying tribute to a different king, and in reality nothing changed. National identity wasn't invented until the early 13th century. That's when countries started consolidating and uniforming the language, religion, borders and bureaucracy. They even invented the national flag, in Denmark 1219. An additional thing to take into consideration is how we perceive the individual. Personal freedom is a thing most of us take for granted today. If I don't want to be married to my wife anymore, I will divorce her. If I find a better job, I will resign. If I would prefer to live somewhere else, I will move. If I respect the criminal code and the traffic law and pay my taxes, I can pretty much do as I please. In the good old days, this wasn't the case. 40 to 80% of the population would be slaves, thralls, serfs, or subject to the whims of the earl, baron, warlord, chieftain, or some other kind of local power dude. You might own a little piece of land to grow your crops or keep some animals, but parts of your time would be allocated to work for the man in the big house.
If you were privileged, that is.
Some people would not be allowed to own anything, and some would be in chains at the slightest risk of escape. Sex before marriage was a punishable crime, marriage was difficult to achieve, and divorce was impossible. When democracy was invented in different forms throughout history, and people were invited to take part in the decision-making, by advisory debate, voting, or consensus, it completely changed the perception of what a human being is, and how he can influence his own fate. If I am sent to war, at least, it is the will of the people.
But people weren't the people we think of today.
People were free male landowners, married, adults belonging to the right ethnic group. Everybody else was excluded. Slavery was abolished in the Western world in the 19th century, and women became people in the 20th century. Unmarried men without property gained the right to vote at about the same time as women. Until the early 20th century, there were no human rights or civil rights, and a landowner or factory owner could punish the insubordinate in the most efficient way, without restrictions. You might be willing to sacrifice yourself for the cause, but he knows that, and he knows that you might not be willing to sacrifice your family or village, so they will be the ones to feel his anger. Retaliation by proxy.
This is worth keeping in mind when you read history, thinking, why didn't he simply refuse?
From the time democracy was invented to the present day, the perception of individual identity, freedom, and rights has changed one little bit at a time. Women in the 1930s weren't citizens. They were an extension of their husbands. The first initial step towards women's suffrage was actually married men being given 2 votes in elections. He could vote on her behalf, but she couldn't vote herself. Fake news. History is full of fake news. Fake news in the sense that the news isn't new. We have a tendency to praise our own generation at the expense of earlier generations. If we can claim any discovery or invention as a result of our own enlightened era, by God we will. In the 14th century they would gladly brag about how marvelous they were themselves, while the 12th century was a dark era of ignorance, and in the 16th century they would refer to the 14th century as the Dark Ages, while in fact the development from the 12th to the 16th century really isn't that remarkable. There are countless examples of fake news in history. The Renaissance astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus was the first to discover that the Earth revolves around the Sun, the heliocentric model, in 1543. He died shortly after, but the Church banned his book and persecuted anyone who adopted his ideas, just as they had previously burned people at the stake for claiming the Earth is a globe. Good story but bullshit. Aristarchus of Samos described the heliocentric model in 280 BC, 1823 years earlier, and he probably wasn't the first. In 240 BCE, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference, with an error of 40 kilometers. And again, nothing proves that he was the first. And nobody has ever been burned by the Church for claiming the Earth is a globe. In fact, we have no knowledge of anyone ever describing the Earth as anything other than a globe.
But we do love to depict people in the past as stupid or ignorant.
Christopher Columbus had no idea about the existence of the Pacific Ocean. For that reason he believed the American coast was a part of Asia. But he knew exactly where it was, and what it would take to get there, long before his first voyage. He had several sources of easily accessible information. What he was afraid of was all the empty fields in his spreadsheet. Can we carry enough fresh water and other supplies if we have to endure the dreaded calm wind in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? He didn't discover anything new or surprising. And the spreadsheets became his downfall. He never made enough money on his expeditions to cover the expenses. The one who made a huge discovery to the Europeans was Amerigo Vespucci, who determined that the Pacific Ocean makes America an independent continent.
Thus it is named after him.
Did he discover this after a meticulous survey, or was he simply informed by the locals? It's actually not until over 100 years after Christopher Columbus died, we dragged his name out of a drawer, dusted it, and claimed he'd discovered America. Some will mention that Greenlandic Viking Leif, the Lucky Ericsson, found America as early as 1000 CE.
But he too knew exactly where to go, how to get there, and what he would find.
Many discoverers, inventors, and scientists are being credited for things that were definitely not their achievement, simply so we can brag about being smarter than our forefathers.
It's a kind of time racism.
We now know that Neanderthals wove dyed cloth, cured diseases, sailed the Mediterranean, seasoned food, made precision tools, and in some cases assimilated with the new immigrants. The Göbekli Tepe structure and surrounding finds reveals that 12,000 years ago people in southeastern Turkey were capable of engineering and architecture that shouldn't have been possible for these primitive pre-pottery Neolithic hunter-gatherers. Come again, pre-pottery.
Trust me, if they could erect these structures they could no doubt make pottery.
We just haven't found any.
These were highly skilled people.
4,600 years ago the Egyptians built the pyramids in Giza, along with marvelous temples and palaces. 2,800 years ago, the underground cities of Derinkuyu and Kamakli were built, containing hundreds of tunnels complete with air vents and emergency exits. About the same time, the Romans used self-repairing concrete, a party trick science is still struggling to figure out. None of these came as an epiphany or aided by aliens, but as a result of trials and errors and slow development using math and other planning tools. So we still have even older things to find that will blow our minds. Claiming that the ancient Greek city-states, the Renaissance or the Age of Discovery, presented revolutionary breakthroughs in human capability and thinking is simply fake news. Whites are us. We know for a fact that modern civilization began in Greece with white marble statues, democracy and philosophy, and spread north through Europe, making us so much more sophisticated than the primitive people in other parts of the world.
How do we know that?
Well, because every time we have found evidence to the contrary, we have destroyed that shit and buried it. God forbid anyone should ever think that there were advanced civilizations in Africa before the white man came. How, you may ask, the fuck can we adapt history so efficiently to fit our narrative, and get away with destroying evidence, rewriting the past, deleting knowledge and implement fake old so systematically? The answer is depressingly simple. For a time we had outstanding means of transportation, flawless bureaucracy and superior weapons. These three advantages we used to tell the darker people how, and especially why.
The white man's burden is to elevate them to our level, or as close as they can get.
In the meantime, they will have to endure being subhuman. A vital part of the dehumanization process is to enforce education that will establish our narrative.
Oh massa, me be so happy you white man come tell me how marvelous you are.
Archaeology with dynamite, to find the gold and the good stuff for the European museums, and make the rest disappear. How many synonyms for primitive and inferior can we come up with to describe the Mali Empire? Mainly to blur the fact that the Mali Empire in the 13th century was in every perceivable way more advanced than anything you could find in Europe at the same time.
And what do we do with the Inca and Mayan empires?
Well, some human sacrifices have definitely taken place, so if we can pump up the numbers to something sufficiently extreme, we can always claim that we rescued them from self-annihilation. Nowhere is source critique as important as when we read African American, Asian, and Australian history written by Europeans.
Pardon my French, but Jesus fucking Christ, a lot of horseshit.
The main problem was Asia. Many places in Asia had just as good a bureaucracy as we did, and they were too many, so even with better weapons, we simply couldn't devalue the sophistication in ancient China, India, and Southeast Asia. We had to claim somehow that they simply lost it somewhere between ancient and now. For some reason they had turned into barbarians. And then we took the worst shit any of them had come up with, opium from India, and distributed it to the rest of Asia just to prove a point and cash in. Wokeism. Before this gets too woke, let me in turn warn you about woke history. Europeans eradicated the native population in America.
Not entirely true.
Or rather, not by design. Yes, there were battles between Native Americans and Europeans, and yes, more Native Americans died from these battles, but the almost extinction was actually the result of the battle of biology. They gave us syphilis.
And we gave them smallpox.
Smallpox wins. Syphilis is a slow killer and spreads slowly, and is even avoidable. Smallpox is a fast spreader and a fast killer. Without the immunity for that shitshow, their fate was sealed, and their days were numbered. Of all the Native Americans that died out, following European immigration, about 80% died from smallpox and other transmitted diseases. I'm not saying it didn't sit well with the eager European land grabbers, but it wasn't exactly planned. Another woke perception you must take with a grain of salt is the legality of presence. The argument you will read a lot, often as an implication, is the white had no right to be there. Well, who has? The Dutch emigrants to present-day South Africa, who even had the audacity to call themselves Afrikaans, claim they moved in on terra nullius, uninhabited land. Some places true, other places not so much. In many cases they initially, or at a later point, took ownership of land that belonged to indigenous people. However, these indigenous people were not always the original settlers, as they themselves had conquered the land from other groups of people. And some indigenous people moved into South Africa later than the Europeans, but due to the color of their skin they are, by some, perceived as more entitled to the land. The white light up, and are easily recognized as a group that doesn't really belong. The booming colony attracted many migrant workers from other parts of Africa, and even shiploads of people from India. But as the white people were in charge, and by default the bad guys, even Indian migrants are less misplaced in South Africa, according to some very woke history writers. The first Dutch migrants came in 1652, but as it was a small and weak colony, the British took control in 1795. So, do the Dutch have more right to the land than the British?
And what about some of the groups of Xhosa and Zulu that crossed the border even later than the Dutch, the British, the Indian and the Chinese?
They have ethnic bonds to people living there before the white people arrived, but they themselves are basically intruders. And speaking of borders, who made them, how and why? What if people of different groups respect different sets of borders? When a fat white man says in a thick South African accent, "Those bloody Kaffir black African immigrants," you are completely right that he's an asshole.
But you may not be right that he is wrong.
If his family came in 1670 to an area where nobody was living, set up a farm, and continued to live there, just trying to make a living and stay out of trouble, black Africans can actually be perceived as immigrants to that area. I'll give you another example of a not straightforward matter. In 985, Eric the Red arrived in Greenland with 14 ships and made 2 settlements in other people's land.
Or was it?
4,000 kilometers to the north, the Inuits were living. There had been Inuits in Greenland before, but they had disappeared, and these new Inuits arrived from Canada to no man's land in the north, more or less at the same time the Europeans arrived in the south. And these 4,000 kilometers weren't travelable. In short, these 2 groups of people had no clue about the other group's existence. As the climate changed in the 14th century, the Inuits moved south and, behold, they met the Vikings. If the one to touch it first automatically have ownership of an entire island, even an island 4 times the size of France, it would probably belong to the Inuits. But in that case the Vikings had settled in good faith, and lived there for 300 years, clueless of their intrusion. You will find history books that will refer to Eric the Red as an occupier. I'll leave that assessment up to you, but simply point out that it's not always a slam dunk.
Asking the right questions.
Whether it's too woke or not woke enough, whether it's wildly exaggerated one way or the other, you always have to ask the same questions before you accept the narrative: who wrote it and why? It's extremely rare for anyone to write history simply to inform factual events, and even if they do, they will have been influenced by people with opinions, the modern ethics, and even pop culture.
Of course, there were no female warriors in the Viking armies. That is preposterous to even suggest. Of course, there were plenty of women in the Viking armies.
That is ridiculous and misogynist to deny. A local documentarist described the battlefield after a Viking attempt at the walls of Constantinople. What he emphasized was the number of slain female Viking warriors.
But not a single female warrior has been mentioned in any other contemporary sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles or Adam of Bremen.
Only males have been found in warrior graves, until we started using DNA, and found that some of the men were actually women. Why had we thought them to be men? Because of the grave goods, swords, shields, axes, and so on. So now they are women.
But maybe the grave goods weren't theirs and hadn't been used by the dead. Well, then you could say the same thing about the male graves.
Can we check the skeleton for marks of battle?
And so on.
What every archaeologist is fantasizing about is finding a female warrior grave that leaves no doubt. Books will be written, documentaries will be shot, songs will be sung. A male grave, on the other hand, is nothing new or interesting. We are in the middle of a war on misogyny, and history has to play a role in this war. Not actually because we give a shit about what life was like in the Viking Age. 1,000-year-old history is interesting because of now.
Not because of then.
Just as important now as it was when people wrote about Caligula. Interpretations. I wrote a book about the Viking Age, advertising, buy Vikingology today, and tried my best not to get carried away. Every second sentence is we think, we believe, or presumably. Truth is, we have some grave goods, some post holes, a few sunken ships, and some runestones. The things that are durable, and the things people wanted to flash 1,000 years ago. From these items we have guessed, presumed, and interpreted what life was like in the Viking Age. We have some contemporary writers who profoundly disliked the Vikings, and some fan fiction written 200 years later. In the National Museum in Copenhagen, the exhibitions are constantly being updated to reflect new finds, new discoveries, and especially the ethics of our own time. Very skilled scientists, like bioarchaeologists, can now see where a person is born, and where he or she has been for extended periods of time, only from a partial skeleton.
But we don't have any contemporary Viking writers describing their own lives.
With a limited number of archaeological finds, and a few contemporary authors who contradict each other, we don't have a lot to go on. I have already mentioned the controversy about female warriors. Another example is, did they have tattoos or not? Ibn Fadlan describes some Kievan Rus Vikings. Their skin was decorated with floral patterns from their fingertips to their necks, which might mean all over. He met them on a journey near the Black Sea. No other contemporary writers have described them with tattoos. And it's striking in a world where tattoos are unknown, not to mention it if you see it. My best guess is not. Decorated, could be makeup, and the Kievan Rus Vikings could have been influenced by Slavic people for a long time before Ibn Fadlan met them, so even if it was tattoos, it definitely doesn't mean it was common among Vikings.
But you see what I'm doing here, deducting and guessing.
Reality is, I don't have a clue. I'm not an eyewitness, and if this was a courtroom, I would be dismissed, in spite of having read everything you can possibly read about Norse people in the Viking Age. The same Ibn Fadlan described a Viking funeral. That is the only description we have, and it's dragged out and used to interpret every single grave we find. What if the funeral he witnessed was unique, heavily influenced by the Slavic neighbors, and every other Norse person in the Viking Age would have commented on this experience with a "what the fuck?" Having only one single description of a ceremony is simply not enough to claim that it's typical. Especially not so far away from Scandinavia. We have one single description of the temple in Uppsala, by Adam of Bremen, who hasn't visited the grand gold-plated temple himself. So it's hearsay. According to leading archaeologists, the temple wasn't actually a structure, but an open space. If they are right, the only description we have is completely made up. If that's the case, we have zero descriptions, and good reasons to dismiss all Adam's ramblings as completely worthless. So we are guessing and making things up to fit our favorite narrative. In 1876, set designer Carl Emil Derpler created horned helmets for the first Bayreuther Festspiele production of Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen. If you visit a souvenir shop now in any of the Nordic countries, you will find all the figurines of Vikings have horned helmets, just like every logo on every venue and bus company. History Channel Netflix series Vikings will show you Vikings with tattoos from their fingertips to their necks.
But not floral patterns.
Runes. Now every tattoo parlor in the Nordic countries will offer authentic Viking tattoos. So we're pouring pop culture over history. Eventually it will seep into the museums, and from there into history books. Our interpretations will inevitably be influenced by fashion and fiction. Grab your favorite history book, read a few pages, and imagine how they would be different if the same book had been written 40 years previously or later. When I write about Eric the Red, I try to imagine him. I'm influenced by the people I have encountered in my life, and he reminds me of someone.
I don't like him.
That will influence my description, no matter how hard I try to be objective. Another history writer will have a different experience and will like him. He will remind her of someone completely different, and the description will reflect this.
On a research trip to the Shetland Islands, I met a wonderful girl.
This will affect how I will describe these islands, even in a textbook about events that took place 1,000 years ago. What I'm trying to say is this: personal experiences will inevitably influence the interpretations by archaeologists, historians, museum curators, writers, etc. Keep that in mind. Can I trust this writer? My name is Hassa Hassan Sorensen. I'm a writer specializing in history, with the twist that I try to fit into your local pub rather than the academic establishment. I'm only as good as my academic sources, and they suck. I make it suck even more by jazzing it up with popular references and swear words. No, you can definitely not trust me.
But you can buy me a beer, and I'll tell you a fucking good story.
I know for a fact that you can't trust any of the other writers either, which this book is actually about: how to read history with the right grain of salt. I've written a few good books in English that you might find entertaining and slightly informative. The big one is Hammered History, the entire history of the world squeezed into 540 pages of swear words. There's Vikingology, where you will find all the answers about Nordic people in the Viking Age, and recently I published The Ice-Cold Story of Kalalet Nunnart, Greenland. Besides these, I have published some odd books in one of my favorite languages, Danish.
If you get it, you get it. If not, just forget it.
All my books can be found at propagandaministeriet.dk. As all history writers, I'm biased, opinionated, influenced, misinformed, interpreting subjectively, and a child of my time. I even have a runic tattoo, for Christ's sake. When Donald Trump is done, I will write the final book about the rise and fall of the United States of America, and I will not even try to be academic about it. You know, just like the people who first wrote about Caligula.